Hi, welcome back. This is the Catholic Lady, and today we are reading Great Lion of God by Taylor Caldwell. This particular book is out of print. It is available, however, if you look for it in used bookstores online occasionally, and so if you do some searching, you can indeed find it. Even some of the libraries don't have it anymore. But it is a favorite of mine from my childhood, from the 70s. And so today we are reading chapter 2. So I'll begin. Hillel ben Baruch was entertaining guests at dinner. There was his old severe and Pharisee friend, Rabbi Isaac ben Ezekiel, and his brother-in-law, David, brother of Deborah, a luxurious gentleman and aristocrat from Jerusalem, David ben Shabuah. At the foot of the long, golden-draped table sat Deborah, the modern woman who was not to be confined to the women's quarters in spite of Rabbi Isaac's overt disapproval. She thought him a dull, somewhat dirty old man, and young Saul's tutor, the Greek Aristo, and Saul himself, now 5 years old. She knew that her presence, the pagan Greek's presence, and even the presence of the child were resented, deplored, and despised by the old rabbi, and this gave her a sensation of childish malice and amusement. As for Aristo, he was a Greek of discernment, for all he was a freedman, and he appreciated her qualities of mind and her sensibility to Greek poetry, and her knowledge of the arts and sciences. The sun was setting, the dreadful, distorted, fanged mountains rearing in scarlet beyond the open doors and windows of the dining room. The peacocks were screeching, and the hot air was heavy with the scent of flowers and dust and heated stone. Deborah could hear the newly loud pattering of the fountains, the mutter of stirring trees. She could see the green of lush grass beyond the portico, dark pointed towers of cypresses, and the purple blossoms of the myrtles. She was proud and content. Her house might not be the largest in the suburb, or the most splendid, but it was a work of art and taste. The dining room was spacious and square, of splendid proportions, with a floor of yellow and black marble squares, like gold and ebony. The murals on the white walls were excellent, if a little extreme in Hillel's conservative opinion, and the plastered ceiling was decorated in rosettes of gold and deep blue. The furniture, the chests and screens, and tables and chairs, had been fashioned in the Eastern manner to be consistent with the environment, and were of lemon wood and dark ebony and teak, elaborately carved and inlaid. Here and there were scattered bright Persian rugs of intricate pattern and a delicate hue. A fresh breeze moved through the pillars of the portico and brought with it a pure country aroma. Now the bells of heathen temples dedicated to Seriphus, Juno, Aphrodite, and all the gods and goddesses of the Rome, Greek, and Oriental pantheon began to ring softly over the land, striving with each other for harmonious notes, blending together to create a background of sweet and nostalgic sound. Deborah sighed happily. Her pretty face was suffused with a glow of combined innocence and complacent pride and stupidity, and Hillel glanced down the long table at her and loved her anew, and wondered, as he often wondered, why she did not bore him to death. Deborah's brother David was, in Hillel's opinion, which could be very acerbic at times, effete, ridiculous, pretentious, and a parody of elegance. He was 4 years older than Deborah, and married to a Roman girl of a great house, and he lived more in Rome than he did in Jerusalem, and called himself an emancipated Jew, the new Jew. He was an intimate friend of Herod himself, and a familiar at the court, and very rich. He had fine manners and graces, and was handsome, of Deborah's auburn and blue coloring of hair and eyes, and beardless, of course, and fair of complexion, with a Greek nose of which he was tediously proud, and a cleft white chin, and his figure was another source of his pride, for he was tall and slender. He was also too fastidious in Hillel's conviction, and scented like a woman, and wore many rings on his long and delicate hands. A complicated and detailed Egyptian necklace, fringed and jeweled, hung about his neck and lay on his chest. Gemmed bracelets clasped his upper arms, and a jeweled earring sparkled in one ear. His toga was of the whitest and most shimmering silk, bordered with gold, and his sandals glittered. Hillel always tried to despise him as a decayed traitor to his race and his God. But David was so charming, so amusing, so smiling, and even so erudite, that Hillel invariably and helplessly was seduced into fondness for him on his frequent visits to his house. David certainly was a Sadducee, and therefore even worse than an uninformed heathen, but he was a scholar, equally at home in discussing the Torah, Philo, Euripides, Sophocles, Virgil, and Homer, and the latest scandals from Rome and Jerusalem and Alexandria and Athens, politics, poetry, the sciences, the stock market and banking, the state of the drachma and the sesterce, the newest favorite of Caesar Augustus, the Augustules of Rome, rumors from the Palatine, architecture, archaeology, trade, commerce, and religion in all its forms, not to mention the latest fashions in living, clothing, dining, and amusement. Once or twice, in sheer exasperation at so much sweetness of light and urbanity and composure and politeness, Hillel, the mildest of men, had attempted to provoke David into a temper or a sharp reply or a contemptuous gesture. But David never defected from his pose, if it were a pose, of a totally civilized man. He would never, Hillel would think with some unkindness, impose himself on his wife if she were unwilling, or quarrel in a vulgar way with a tradesman, or dispute with a stockbroker, or pick his nose, or rub his anus, though he had no objection to a naughty story, and could hint of unspeakable vilenesses of conduct of friends and acquaintances. Reb Isaac, the old Pharisee friend, sat munching morosely at Hillel's right hand this evening, casting dark looks alternately at Deborah, who did not flinch, but loftily ignored him, and darker looks at the perfumed David. He would flap his hand when David spoke in his musical and cultured accents, in Greek, of course, and as if waving away a cloud of inconsequential gnats, and he would make rude sounds as he chewed, and would gurgle as he drank the wine. A veritable pig, thought Deborah, without charity. Only when Hillel spoke did the rabbi give any attentiveness to the table, and stopped stuffing his mouth with large portions of bread, or examining each dish with intense suspicion, as if it were poisoned or unfit for the pure intestines of a pious Jew. He was bent and gnarled, though curiously fat and shaped like a turnip. He had a long black beard without a sign of whiteness in spite of his age, and his expression was black and fierce, as were his eyes, and his nose was deplorably huge and predatory, resembling a Phoenician's. His clothing was of the coarsest linen, and of a dull dark brown, and Deborah was certain that he smelled rankly, which was not true. He was rich and learned, and feared in the temple, and was often in Jerusalem, and spoke of himself as the poorest and humblest of men, and was arrogant, opinionated, and intolerant, though very eloquent and wise when it pleased him. He was also what Deborah called a heresy hunter, and devoted ferociously to the law and the book, and therefore an anachronism in those enlightened days. Deborah loathed him. It enraged her to learn from her husband that Reb Isaac would not only instruct young Saul in the proper pious studies of a Pharisee, or a Pharisaical Jew, he was already instructing the lad, but would be Saul's mentor and would choose his menial trade. He was a weaver of goats here. Surely, Deborah would protest with tears, Even a Septuagint Jew no longer believed that all Jews must not only be learned, but must embrace a humble trade involving the hands and sweaty labor, no matter how rich and distinguished of the family. It was ridiculous. Did Hillel himself now practice his trade of cabinet making? It was true that it pleased him to carve a small chest on occasion, or a chair for the nursery, or a little table, but did he pursue it sedulously as the law demanded? No, indeed. No one knows, Hillel would say mysteriously, but he never explained that one might never know. It was infuriating. Tonight Deborah was happy. David was her favorite brother. She was vexed that Hillel, when David was a guest, invariably invited that obnoxious old Pharisee to his table. She did not know that Hillel found both Reb Isaac and David abrasive to his temperament, and that he found himself irritably honed by them, and relieved from his own amenity by annoyance. Sometimes he wondered what it would be like to be a Roman, to be filled with materialistic certitude and no doubts, and to tread the ground firmly and not to discover questions in the earth. Between the two stones of Reb Isaac and David ben Shabuah, he sometimes felt the rough grinding of an elusive answer which, he reasoned, he would always reasoning, might be an answer to all but only his abraded sensibilities become tender and sensitive and skinless. He looked down the table at his son, little Saul, 5 years old, sitting silently beside his mother. He smiled affectionately at the child, but Saul was listening to David with that strange intentness of his, which was most unchildlike. Surely not a handsome lad, but curiously dominating for all his short stature, his breadth of chest and shoulder, his muscular arms and strong bowed legs. His eyes had become more strenuous and alive as he grew, and they resembled cold but brilliant blue enamel over iron. His audaciously red hair was cut in a short Roman fashion, like a soldier's, and his big pink ears flared out from his round and virile skull. Deborah might deplore his Phoenician nose, and hint of wantonings in Hillel's impeccable family in the far past, which was probable, Hillel would admit, but Hillel found that nose comfortingly manly and assured and positive, and he did not know why, what should comfort him. He liked the boy's hands, too, square and brown, with short square nails, and the brown sturdy throat and the deep rose on the broad cheekbones, and the scattering of freckles on the low and pugnacious brow. Hillel was not sure about Saul's mouth, wide and thin and mobile. It hinted of argumentation and obstinacy. All in all, the boy had a fierce and concentrated aura about him, a fierce, quick way of turning his head, a rancor of temperament, which Hillel reflected would procure him more enemies than friends in the future. Hillel recalled his daughter Sephora, whom Deborah had wished named Flavia, or Daphne, or Iris, and not some offensive Jewish name. Hillel had threatened her with Leah, or Sarah, or Rebecca, or Miriam, and so had quieted her. Sephora was at least not unmusical. Hillel thought of his little girl, now almost 4 years old, with fond passion, a beautiful golden child with golden eyes and affectionate manners and a humorous dimple on her cheek. She laughed at Saul and teased him. Saul, who rarely tolerated anyone, including his parents, tolerated Sephora, and played with her during the rare intervals of his leisure, and reprimanded her, but would never reduce her to tears. She mocked him. Sephora was not at this table, but in her nursery. Deborah delighted in her beauty and wondered at the large golden eyes and curled the child's golden hair and smeared her delicate complexion with cosmetics against the sun, and debated earnestly with her on the correct costumes to be worn at certain hours of the day, and taught her to sing. It was one of Hillel's few joys to listen to the young voices that evening singing, first some grave song of David's, and then the newest light song which Hillel suspected came from the noisy gutters of Tarsus, carefully rendered innocent. Hillel did not know who was the more childish and naive, his wife or his daughter. At scarcely 4, Sephora would sometimes look at her mother with sudden seriousness, her gilded eyelashes rapidly blinking, and once Hillel was positive that the little one was pitying Deborah. Saul naturally wore the white Roman tunic of pre-adolescence, bordered with purple, on which Deborah insisted. "We are citizens of the Roman world," Deborah said. "We are citizens of the kingdom of God," said Hillel. Deborah thought this absurd, that there was but one world dreamed of by the ancients, ruled by peace and law, and therefore secure. Ruled by the Romans' short sword, Hillel would say, with rare bitterness. But to Deborah it was a safe world for her family, and that was all that was important. It did not harm, though she did this secretly for fear of Hillel, to make a quiet sacrifice in the temple of Juno, the mother of the gods and men. Juno was an exemplary mother. And we're going to take a break right there. We will return with the rest of chapter 2.